Welcome back, Tankers. We've got an awesome podcast lined up for you today, talking all things property and town planning when it comes to dealing with council and planning legislation and zoning. We've got an expert on here, a subject matter expert, keeping that thing rolling. Episode 13.
Episode 13, and we've got a little bit of a budget update. Not exhaustive, but just hitting the highlights.
And we've got Mitch here from Formed Town Planning, so say good day to the crew, Mitch.
G'day Tankers, glad to be here.
Good to have you. We've got an awesome 50-50 at the end, or this or that. Stay tuned for it. Some great Q&As today as well, so we look forward to taking you guys through it. Stay tuned and look forward to getting involved.
Welcome back to Money in the Tank after a bit of a Mother's Day break.
Welcome back all, and 9-0 for the D's. Kicking goals.
Customary intro, got to talk about the D's on this pod.
Absolutely. And I forgot to tell Arnie, next week we've got our guest lined up in the real estate game who's a Carlton supporter, so we'll make sure we talk footy with him too.
They actually did all right, the Blues, the Blue Baggers. They scared me a little bit. The first half, they were better than us.
Yeah, they're all right. They always love to say how they're the next Melbourne. You know, they're up and coming, but they've been saying that for 20 years. But, no one can boast the 9-0 figures that we have at the moment, can they?
No, they can't. But they did get Cruiser back in the day in the tanking fiasco. But anyway, by the time this comes out, we'll have played the Crows, so it could be 10-0.
Could be 10-0. We'll see how we go. But we're excited to be here today. I don't know what episode we're up to, Arnie. 14? 13? So 13, we've got another guest on. We're continuing the guest series in the property realm at the moment. So we've got town planner Mitch Seach. Say good day, Mitch.
G'day guys, how are we?
From Formed Town Planning. So we've followed up with some development stuff from Culver the other week, and then we had Marty on from the Loan Room. So we've got some town planning expertise on today through Mitch. And then next week we'll have real estate through Vin, through Utopian Group. So we hope you've been enjoying the live in office setup and in person podcasting.
But before we get to town planning, my favourite segment, Rivkin.
Rivkin rules. All right, here we go. So we've got the book. Flick the pages. See where we land. All right, page 83. Renee on success. This one is. So it is great employers think like owners, and then never underestimate the importance of being able to motivate people. There you go. Couple of gems from old Rivkin there.
Great employers think like owners. That's an interesting one because they say
Great employees, I should say. Did I say employers?
I think you said employers. Wait, read it again.
Great employees think like owners.
See, I don't know about that, Rivkin. See, I would think that a good shareholder should think like an owner, but what incentive does an employee have to think like an owner?
No, we can't ask him.
Oh, no, we can't. Anyway.
All money tilts to the top, doesn't it?
That's it.
So, I guess, we wanted to run through a little bit of the budget news as well. So, do you want me just to hit the winners and losers that I picked out? I didn't get all of them.
Do some quick hitter budget talk. We won't go too heavy with it. We'll give it a few minutes just to give everyone a quick update on some of the budget things, yeah.
Well, yeah, some of the interesting ones I thought was $1.9 billion in vaccines over the next 5 years, and they're going to invest in mRNA vaccine production, which is the one that was used to formulate coronavirus vaccine. Renewable energy was a loser. There's no new direct funding, only $30 million for the big battery and microgrid project between Catherine and Darwin in the NT.
Is there something to do with them giving a tax break, though, to renewable energy companies?
You'll have to Google it, because I did not look that deep into it.
I thought there was something, they're doing a 15% tax rate for any company that is something to do with renewable, I'm sure.
Okay.
Check that out.
I want to look at that, because that would be interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in that space. Women, $354 million, and I didn't get all of what they're investing in, but $100 million of that was for improving cervical and breast cancer screening, and $47 million was towards depression services for pregnant or new mums, which is a good thing. They reckon tourism's a bit of a loser because even though they said we're going to open up international borders late this year, they've now pushed it back to mid-2022. $17.7 billion going to aged care, which is a huge one. $1.7 billion to childcare, which mainly is going to go towards the changes to the subsidy scheme. The low and middle income tax offset with the ATO was meant to finish 30 June this year, but that's being extended out for another 12 months. And $2.3 billion towards mental health. Oh, and the most important, the breweries are getting tax relief.
Yeah, breweries too. Yeah, a couple to note in there. The interesting one I heard the other day and was reading about was the the childcare one, it's an interesting thing around that, because they haven't got a lot of migration at the moment, obviously, and international people coming through to help pick up jobs. So they're actually trying to incentivise people that, whether it be males or females, that maybe have a child that they can't really afford the childcare, so they end up staying at home and not working. They're trying to actually entice those people back into the workforce to pick up those sort of jobs that are coming and being created and left vacant. So I think that's a good initiative. Hopefully comes to fruition and works well for them and keeps the economy ticking along like it has been. A couple of planning ones, like from a financial side of things, that sort of impact the area of finances, is downsizer contributions for people over age 60. It was 65 plus. A couple of others is some contribution changes to superannuation as well. Off the top of my head, they're doing some pension loan scheme changes, which are for the better. So some really good initiatives in that regard too.
And they're raising the rate. They said they're committed to raising the
superannuation as well. Yeah. So yeah, some good changes, and some things to help people out in certain areas. The home scheme ones are interesting as well, given we're doing a property podcast. So they're doing the 2% deposit for single parents. They're increasing or extending the $10,000 10,000 people grant for the government-backed lenders mortgage insurance, which was quite successful too. So they've extended a few things out there, and the home builder one, so the government grant for the build too. So
that's not an exhaustive list, Tankers. Definitely go have a look at it. But yeah, there's some good stuff there. Anyway, let's get into it, because Mitch is sitting here and I want to start asking him some questions. So Mitch, why don't you give us like a high-level background of how you got into planning and what it is for the Tankers?
Yeah, g'day Tankers. Happy to be talking to you. And look, I've had a planning background for about 10 years now, working in a mixture of local government, which are councils, and then also the private sector more recently for the last 3 to 4 years. So yeah, a good decade of experience in statutory planning predominantly. I haven't worked in strategic planning, so...
Tell us about quickly formed TAM planning. So for the listeners, how do they, what do you do for people, and how do they reach you?
Yeah, look, part of a planning or a statutory planner's services is we look at a range of things regarding planning applications which help developers, even mum and dad developers, get planning permits through council. So as part of my job, assisting developers look at due diligence for sites. So what's a good site for a development, where to look, which areas, what zones, what overlays, site constraints, things like that.
And how do people get in contact with you? I mean, we'll come back to it at the end, but just give a plug now.
Well, yeah, look, I don't have a website up yet, Arnie, but you can find the email in the show notes. I'll give my email to Joel and yourself, and
great,
easy
the email address on there.
So you were mentioning 2 different types of TAM planning, and I'm a total noob, Mitch. You said statutory. What was the other one?
The other one's strategic planning. So that deals with broader master framework planning and planning scheme amendments. So each council will have predominantly 2 planning departments. One will be statutory and the other will be strategic. So statutory deals with the planning permits for individual sites, whereas strategic planning deals with more high-level master planning of suburbs and particular areas.
Kind of like macro versus micro in a way. That's cool.
It is in some sense, yep.
All right. And well, that's good. That's a good overview. I guess so. The next one, well, maybe we'll jump into, is just general information on different zones, res codes, overlays. What does all that mean, and how does it work specifically around Victoria?
Yeah, look, happy to give a bit of a planning 101, I guess. So, look, as part of each land in Victoria is covered by what's called a zone, and that affects almost every parcel of land in the state, except for some where they have army bases, which is a separate thing altogether. But for the everyday listener, you're going to have residential zones, commercial zones, industrial zones, farmland zones, greenwedge zones, things like that. So each parcel of land has a different objective, if you want to call it that. There's different planning permissions required for different things, so buildings and works or use are the 2 main ones. And then you have things like tree removal, car parking dispensations, advertising signs. So there's a whole range of considerations within the planning scheme that really just about influencing the urban environment and how land is used within Victoria. So there's 50 plus councils within the state, each have their own planning scheme, which is guided by the Victorian planning provisions, which is the state state level planning policies essentially that inform and trickle down to the local level, which have local planning policies for each municipality. So there's a hierarchy of residential zones. You have your residential growth zone, which is the highest level of intensity for residential growth.
Yeah, so tell us the main zones. So sorry to cut you off there, but if we were try to explain, the main kind of zoning or the overlays. So if we talk apartments, for example, so CBD or some of the bigger suburban areas, what would you call that zone? You're about to get to that then.
Yeah, so the residential growth zone is the highest order zone in the suite of residential zones. You also have activity centre zones and commercial one zones and mixed use zones, not to confuse the listeners. It's a lot to take in. But then you'll have a middle tier zone, which is your general residential zone. So they're found throughout all municipalities, more or less. Yeah. So like, your Dandenongs and Whitehorses, they'll have a lot of their area within the municipality as general residential zone, which is kind of your medium density infill development.
So give us an example. So give us an example firstly for the growth zone. So that might be apartments, going up near a busy sort of shopping district or area where
that's right.
The council's sort of seen that as a growth corridor.
Trying to drive growth into that spot.
That's right, yeah. So the area's council's strategic planning department will look for growth and to direct growth and encourage high density built form is your residential growth zones, which are located, along railway corridors or main roads or to the periphery of activity centres, for example.
Yep.
The zone as a default under the Victorian planning provisions allows 13.5 metres in height, which is around 4 stories.
Yep.
Councils can vary that if they have a schedule to the zone, and then it gets lesser. So the general residential zone is 3 stories and 11 metres. And then you've got the lowest tiered zone, if you want, for the suite of predominant residential zones, which is the neighbourhood residential zone.
So if you go back just one step to that, the middle one that you're mentioning before, which is what was that general zone?
General residential
zone. So your places like you mentioned, Whitehorse and those areas or Dandenong, where there's scope to be able to do. We're talking multiple lot divisions. Are we still talking some unit apartment living or?
Yeah, it's to be read in conjunction or in combination with council's local planning policies as well. So there's a raft of considerations that a council's planning department have to consider when they're looking at a prospective application from a developer, such as a subdivision. So general residential zones usually allow townhouse developments or dual occupancies. You can do some apartments in certain areas, but you're obviously restricted by the height controls. But in residential hinterland areas, certain general residential zones, you can't do apartment buildings just because of the neighbourhood character, which is another concept that might be new for the tankers that aren't familiar with planning.
Meaning that things have to be sort of like in some councils they have to be uniform. Is that what that means?
Yeah, uniformity is a part of it. It's more about distinctive built form features found within a particular area. So a certain area of a suburb, not necessarily a suburb in its entirety, might have a distinctive character. So.
I can think of a good example. It's not Australian, but when I was in England back in the day, there's a suburb called Bath, and I think the houses have to be painted a certain colour because that's just the way it looks. Is that the kind of thing?
That's very restrictive. You wouldn't get that in Australia necessarily. Look, there are some heritage precinct areas that have external paint controls, but neighbourhood character rarely controls the colour of paint in Victoria.
Can I just go back a step? Because you were mentioning like the height restrictions on certain levels of, I'm probably using the wrong terminology, Mitch, but what about building down? Is there any restriction on like going under your property?
That's a good question, Arnie. Not necessarily. I haven't seen too many examples of that. You can dig down and include basements in most neighbourhood residential, most residential zones.
As long as you're not hitting services.
It's just a costly exercise.
Yeah.
I was thinking.
It might not stack up for too long.
Costly exercise to estimate. So we'll have to get Roscoe in there to talk about the build cost estimation, see whether it stacks up.
Can do a joint episode with Roscoe.
And what's the? We did actually mention that, do a joint episode. And what's the lowest zone again? You mentioned
Well, look, out of the 3 main residential zones, which is your residential growth, general residential zone, and neighbourhood residential zone, you also have what's called a low density residential zone and some other zones, but they're less common. They're more out in the peri-urban regional areas.
Yeah.
Park Orchards is a low density residential zone. So.
Park Orchards, low res.
That's peri-urban, isn't it?
Low res, Park Orchards, all right.
No developments here.
Out near the Wazadi, or not. So the neighbourhood residential zones, the state government's chopped and changed with consecutive governments on what you can do in the neighbourhood residential zones. So I think it was Matthew Guy that brought in the 2 dwellings per lot rule, which got scrapped, and now it's a garden area, so mandatory minimum garden area requirements. So you can have as many dwellings as you want on the neighbourhood residential zone. Obviously, it's subject to council approval and satisfying the minimum garden area requirements. Yep. So density is not a reason to refuse an application in the neighbourhood residential zones.
There you go.
That's good info.
Good info. A lot of info on the different zones out there for people. So, so the res codes and the overlays. So,
well, res code. Yeah, we should touch on res code because res code is essentially what informs a lot of the design of dwellings or townhouses. Yeah, dwellings is another word for townhouses. We commonly refer to dwellings in the planning scheme. So res code is essentially or generally 34 objectives and standards which inform built form outcomes on sites, on development sites. So things like setbacks from the front, from the side, from the rear, site coverage and permeability coverage percentages. So different things like that. You also have landscaping criteria, height controls, etc.
Easements, would that fall into there?
So easements is another thing again. They're what's commonly known as an encumbrance on the certificate of title. So you might have an easement which is 1.83 metres from the rear boundary, for example, or its width. It might be drainage or sewage, and that'll be registered on the title. It'll also designate who it's in favour of, whether it's the local authority, such as council, or South East Water, or Yarra Valley Water, for example.
Yep.
So that also.
And then there's covenants as well, which can be.
Yeah, so covenants is a whole different beast. So covenants, and you also have Section 173 agreements, without getting too technical. That just is a section of the Planning and Environment Act, which essentially is an agreement between council and the landowner, which runs in perpetuity on the title, which means it doesn't expire. It's on there for the life of the land, essentially, or until someone removes it. And so they're what's commonly known as burdens to the land.
So what would be an example of a covenant?
Yeah, so you might get a single dwelling covenant or a materials covenant, and they essentially place restrictions on any development of the land and require certain obligations of the landowner.
So does that mean, so a council would say, like, in this neighbourhood you can only put 1 dwelling on this piece of property? That's a covenant that they've enforced? Or who would have initiated that?
Yeah, look, they're quite archaic, I would say, in a lot of circumstances. So they come from, the early 1900s or mid-1900s in certain circumstances. So they were really done at the time of the creation of the subdivision, so the subdivision before all our time. So maybe 50 years ago, and maybe the landowner didn't want multiple dwellings on lots in that area, so they had the single dwelling covenant created at that time. They can be varied and they can be removed, but they are difficult to remove or to vary, and there's 2 main avenues. One's through council, one's through the Supreme Court. But yeah, a single dwelling covenant is quite problematic. So if you're looking at purchasing a site, you want to make sure you check the title for any restrictions.
That's a step up, isn't it? Council all the way to the Supreme Court.
Big time. Dennis Denuto.
That's the vibe.
It's Marbo.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we've got a couple of other, I guess, good questions here in terms of the best way to find out about zoning. So is there an easy app in Victoria to look up what zone you fall under with your property?
Yeah, so there's a couple of mechanisms, I would say, or ways of discovering your zoning and your overlays on the land, if there's any restrictions. So the main way that I use from day to day is Land Checker, so landchecker.com.au. There's an easy interactive tool.
Anyone can use that? Like, it's not paid or anything? Or
I think there's a premium and a free subscription. So that gives you your zone of the land, it gives you overlays, gives you aerial imagery as well, I believe. It also gives you like a lot of local government information, the council. Have there been any recent planning permit applications or planning permits issued for that land or nearby as well, actually? Any planning scheme amendments afoot, which is important to know for the development potential of the land as well. And the other one is a state government one, which is definitely free, and that's called VicPlan, which is mapshare.com.au, I believe. Okay. And VicPlan is the state government one, which has a range of information as well.
To be used in conjunction, or just one of the others good enough?
You can, one of, like either or, I think is suitable. Near Maps is also a really good tool. It costs a bit though, so not for everyone, but it does give you up-to-date aerial imagery. So they have drones that fly over parts of Victoria, and
That's sick.
yeah, every month or bi-monthly, I think.
That's cool. I'm into the drones.
Yeah.
So I guess for the tankers, Mitch, if they're thinking about, they want to get in touch with council for whatever reason, what's the best way to go about it if they're thinking about doing something on their property or looking for a,
Whether it be an extension or a subdivision
Yeah,
of the back,
Well, maybe talk us through an extension example, because that is a simple example when a lot of people, I know I have thought about putting an extension on my property. So what would I do? What are the steps?
Well, speak to your local town planner. I think you can either speak to council or you can speak to a private town planner. But look, council, generally they have what's called a duty planner that answers the phones Monday through Friday. So you'll have someone you can directly contact and ask those type of questions. Can I do this or can't I? What are the restrictions in terms of height and site coverage and setbacks? So they should, if they're helpful, give you some guidance and clarity about what you can and can't do on your land. So every council statutory planning department will have a duty planner, or you can rock up to the front counter pre-COVID. I don't know if they're starting to trickle back in yet, but
I could, like, if I wanted to, I could call you. Like, being serious. Like, is this what you...
This is what we do. This is our bread and butter. So as a private planner, we're not beholden to any particular council. We work anywhere in Victoria. It's just a matter of interpreting the legislation or the planning scheme, depending on the municipality. But yeah, that's what we do. We answer questions about what can and can't you do with the land, essentially.
That's cool. Yeah. And what piece of information would I need to give you to understand if I could do an extension? Like, what would I have to give you?
Mainly just the property address, and then we take it from there.
Nothing else, that's it. Just
also if you have a certificate of title, an up-to-date one, that helps. So a lot of prospective clients, for example, that are looking at sites, or prospective developers that are looking at sites, will get the Section 32, which is the real estate document, the legal document, which says things like, it also actually includes a planning property report, so the zones and overlays, but it has the certificate of title within, I think, 30 days. So that'll help us determine if there's any restrictions on title, such as covenants or Section 173 agreements.
cool. All right.
Good. And anything else that we should have asked you that is inherent in town planning, or good 101 things to know with town planning, and whether it be working with council or understanding, a block?
Well, I think sites to look for is probably a good topic. So how do you look for a good site? What separates a good site from a bad site or a not so good site?
That's a really good one for investors. Yeah, good call.
Yeah, particularly for those starting out in the property development game. So you might want to look at doing a dual lock, which is commonly two dwellings on a lot.
Yeah.
So in a common arrangement on a typical lot, which is a rectangular shape, you might have an existing dwelling, and then you might want to put one to the rear. So it's a dual occupancy style development. I'd say it's a relatively common example, but for looking for the best development sites, you probably want a corner block, which is a good site because you gain what's called development efficiencies. So you can have one dwelling facing each road frontage, essentially. So each one has its own access way, its own garage fronting the street, and sense of address.
Crossover, yeah. And you always hear about the corner blocks being the better blocks to get. So
yeah, and another, I guess, rule of thumb is blocks that are wider rather than deeper, because a lot of the planning regulations in Victoria, like Res Code, for example, have particular design requirements that require more width and depth, or width rather than depth, I should say, of a lot. So, the common subdivision lot is about 15.24 metres, the frontage. If you can find ones that are slightly larger than that, it makes things easier.
Oh, you just prompted a random thought bubble in my brain.
Shoot, Arnie.
Is there rules in Victoria about, like, making a home out of shipping containers?
I think there would be, to be honest. Certainly for dual locks, yeah.
Yeah, because I was thinking when you were talking about preferably like wider rather than longer, I was thinking what's a big long shape. And yeah, you've seen those things on the internet where people make houses out of shipping containers.
Yeah, they can be problematic. So like most single dwellings in Victoria don't require planning permission. So if you want to build a brand new single dwelling on a lot, it's usually just the building regulations, which generally mirror up with the planning regulations in terms of Res Code, which is clause 54 for single dwellings. So your side setbacks, etc., have to comply, and they're mirrored with the planning regulations in that regard, but they don't require planning permits through council, which is the main difference.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we've covered some good things there, unless there's anything else that we've missed there, Mitchie.
Oh, look, maybe the other thing to quickly mention is some of the overlays. So the overlays, you have a suite of controls, so again, these affect certain parcels of lands, but not every lot in Victoria has an overlay. It's in addition to the zones.
You can't just roll up to a corner block and think that's good to go for subdivision. Got to check the zoning, check the overlay.
Yeah, it might be in a general residential zone, but it might have a heritage overlay on the site, so that can really restrict or inhibit the development potential, the particular site you're looking at. So
is it certain areas that have a lot more heritage stuff? Is it like in closer into CBD heritage stuff where some of the older properties are?
Usually that's right. Yeah, your inner city councils will generally have heritage precincts more than those out in metropolitan Melbourne or the outer suburbs.
Forgive me again, like just noob question, but does that mean that if it's heritage listed, what you can't develop on it, or you can't build other stuff on it, or you can't do an extension on it?
Well, there's heritage experts, isn't there, and people that you bring in, and it really minimises or mitigates things that you can do. It's very. We were talking about this the other night, myself and Mitch. Councils are quite fastidious around the heritage protection, aren't they?
That's right. Yeah, you have heritage experts or advisors. And they can help inform or guide the development potential of sites and heritage overlays. But to answer your question, Arnie, not necessarily. You can do a range of things on sites with heritage overlays.
You can still do stuff on them.
You can still do stuff. There's some more restrictive than others. So for a property in Boroondara, they have heritage grading. So some are contributory or non-contributory or significant. So there's 3 tiers of heritage grading. In the non-contributory areas, you can potentially demolish the dwelling. Even though it forms part of a heritage precinct identified in a heritage overlay, it may be of no significance to the heritage merit, essentially, of that area. If it's got a significant grading, then you can't really touch it. Maybe you can touch, the rear portion and put a kind of contemporary extension to the back, but usually have to retain 1/3 or thereabouts of the heritage facade at the front.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah. So what's an example of a heritage property in town? Would it be something that's built in a certain era or a certain way or streetscape for that particular neighbourhood?
Yeah, well, it really comes down to the heritage merit of the precinct, or if it's an individual building that maybe not part of a precinct, but it's individually graded. So you have the Victorian Heritage Register as well, which is another layer of heritage controls, if you like. So not all heritage overlays or heritage houses will be affected by the Victorian Heritage Register. So things to look for, you probably have to chat to a heritage advisor, but it might just be the historic value of the house based on its age alone, or its architectural merit, or the actual designer. So who was the architect at the time that designed it?
Yeah, wow.
60 years ago, was he famous? Was he noteworthy?
Quite interesting.
Yeah, you've got...
That's super interesting.
Yeah, and what Joel said before about heritage experts, they often appear at the tribunal, which is known as VCAT, the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, so which is the judiciary for planning matters in Victoria. So it's different to the courts. They're an expert, what's known as an expert tribunal that determines planning applications. So if council refuse your application, you have an avenue for recourse, which is VCAT, thankfully, because councils can make bad decisions from time to time. So
Although too well.
as you're familiar with.
I think Roscoe might have mentioned VCAT as well.
Yeah, Roscoe's been there a couple of times.
I've had a couple of runs there. But,
Success rate there, so
Yeah,
don't mind going to the cattery.
the VCAT, because you'll do appearances to fight for the builder or the developer, and when you've worked for council before, you've done the other side as well as a consultant.
Yeah, that's right. I've been to VCAT numerous times, both acting as an advocate for council, and also for private developers or private clients for a raft of matters. So,
That's good stuff.
Yeah, great.
Thanks for taking us through it, man. That was cool.
Yeah, a lot of information in there. So, obviously, hopefully the listeners out there, the tankers will just pick up snippets that, ring a bell to them or give them food for thought, and just generally trying to educate people around that area, I think, because it is such a complex area and there's so much involved in there. So
it really ties in nicely with Roscoe and Marty's interviews as well. And then Vin will close the loop.
Yeah. So, any questions, feel free to reach out to Mitch. We'll put the email in the show notes, and and we'll give you information there to reach out if you've got any questions or want to ask about Mitch's services if you're needing some help in that regard. So, On to the next area of the podcast today, which is our Q&A section. Yes, Arnie?
Yeah, so the fun doesn't stop. So we'll get Mitch's take on it too. But the first question we had was from Josh, and he was basically saying, is there a holy grail type of book for investing? And specifically what he meant was that takes you through everything. So every type of investing, the steps involved in how you would invest, how you set up like your plans and your goals. Do you want to have a stab at this first, Jolie? Or
Big book. It's a big book. I honestly have never heard of one. There could be one out there. I've always preferred and just enjoyed reading kind of shorter books that might be more succinct and hitting a certain area or hitting a certain topic, because the investment landscape is so broad. I sort of jokingly mentioned on the email, maybe like Investors for Dummies. That might be a book that just takes you through from A to Z, all different types of investing. But yeah, Arnie, I know, is going to mention a couple of share books, like property books, which we've mentioned before. Ones from Margaret Lomas are quite good. Noel Whittaker's got some good books. Barefoot Investor books just talks, general cash flow, finance 101 stuff. So, there's some good books out there, and I think it's always best just to, pick a few that interest you and go through them and read them. Because there's books on, broking, lending, there's books on property, there's books on shares, there's books on stocks, derivatives. There's so many different things out there, but I don't know of any one, book that does it all.
Yeah, I don't know of any book that covers every single thing you want to know. I do think you touched on a really good point, whereas something like Barefoot is a really good overlay for getting your finances in order, and he does touch on the different types of investing, but it's a very high level. I think if you want to learn a specific type of investing, you could find a book on it, and I'll give you an example. I'll give you two examples. There's One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch is a really good book for finding value investments. And he does give some step-by-step instruction on the steps in his method, I guess. So he talks about like how you find the businesses, then how you do some simple valuations on the businesses, and then how you track those businesses over time and make sure they're still performing well. And another good example of a similar style is Phil Town book. So there's Rule 1, which was his first one, which is a little bit dated. Payback Time, which I would recommend the tankers get if they're interested in value investing and want to learn a step-by-step process. And there's another one he did with his daughter called Invested, which I have not read, but I believe it's also based on a podcast they did together where they go through step-by-step that same process that is described in Payback Time. Okay. So, cool. Yeah, and maybe we could talk about that in more detail another time.
Can I ask the two of you if you've read two books? The first one being Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and I think, Joel, you've read it, haven't you?
Yep, read that one.
By Ken...
It's by...
Kiyosaki?
Yeah, Robert Kiyosaki. Yeah. I have read it as well.
Yeah, is that a good book?
Yeah, mate. Have you read it?
I haven't read it, no.
Recommend that. We actually mentioned that in our first or second podcast. So that's a really good book about getting into the mindset of acquiring assets that generate cash flow.
Yeah, and how money works, and how assets can go negative, like buying a new car, or buying something that's going to increase in value. And I think we mentioned a few others, like The Richest Man in Babylon.
Similar type of books, but Rich Dad Poor Dad, great book, really good just as a story. Actually, like it's a well told story.
Easy read.
Yeah, easy read.
Right, and The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham. It's an oldie.
Yep, oldie, big book.
Big book to have. I have it, but I haven't read it.
I've read it. I would say that book, if you want to learn value investing, because Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing, sort of taught Warren Buffett. It's an amazing book, but it's also not a very easy read. The Intelligent Investor is, I would say, start with the Phil Town kind of books, and then here you go. Joel's just pulled it out.
On the table.
Different cover. I've got his first one.
It's a good book, but it gets a bit technical.
It's a lot. It's how many pages are we up to? We're at 604 pages.
Yeah, it's a big one. So you don't tackle that for your first.
Small words. Don't tackle that for your first. Start with some easier ones. It'll actually get your interest, pique your interest a bit, and give you an understanding base level. This one's a very quite an in-depth definitive book on value investing.
Can I also say, like, the investing styles we've referenced, we've really honed in on value investing here, but there's other styles of investing. There's swing trading, there's momentum investing, there's growth investing, there's, all sorts of different types of investing you could do in terms of equities. A really good place to get some sort of basic education is YouTube.
Yeah.
If you're interested in momentum trading, look up some YouTube videos and they'll tell you the basics of it. But yeah.
And there's stuff on the ASX website too, so heaps of things out there. But don't know of any one particular book, but maybe there might be one out there that just does a few A to Z's possibly.
I don't have a holy grail though.
Tell us. Mitch had a one out the side from a philosophy standpoint book that you like reading.
Yeah, so I'm by no means a finance guru, but I'd like to consider myself philosophical. So a good one is Alan Watts, The Wisdom of Insecurity. Mm-hmm. So he was an English philosopher and Taoist practitioner who's passed, I think it was 1973, but his wisdom still carries on today. So you can find a lot of his lectures on YouTube. He used to be on radio in England and also America, and has written a few books. So,
well, mindset, a big part of investing, and we've got one more question to go, but we're going to get to 50-50, and that's why we do it. It's all about mindset. So, what was that one called?
The Wisdom of Insecurity.
I'm going to look it up.
So it's about, essentially in some sense taking risks and not trying to identify with the ego or the self too much. And by having a wisdom of insecurity, you're actually more secure in your own life. It's counterintuitive. Bit of a paradox, Arnie.
I like it. Checking the ego at the door and I love it. Yeah, great.
So the next question was from Brendan. Do you have it handy, Joel?
Yeah. So Brendan's question, avid listener of the podcast. Brendan, shout out to you, mate. Thanks for hitting us up with, you've given us a Q&A and a 50-50 for today.
Oh, okay.
I think I've got to check, I think he even actually, just to throw us in the shit, he's given us another name for 50-50 as well, just to add to the conundrum that we already experienced with What's Your Choice and whatever else.
Either or.
Yeah, so I'll throw that out at the end as well. But Brendan's question came through was in relation to, the current interest rates at the moment with, if you've got a home loan, for example, and you run an offset account, the interest rate that you're getting on your home loan, let's say you're in the mid twos for your interest rate, that then sits in the offset and offsets that interest rate that you're paying. So let's say you got 10 grand sitting in your offset account and you've got a loan of 500,000, then that 10 grand comes off the loan effectively and you don't pay interest on that. So what I guess his question is now is, with interest rates so low, I guess where does that come into play with, is that money still worth sitting in the offset or is it worth being invested elsewhere?
Yeah, okay. So the general in nature, as always on the pod.
Always general in nature. Any conversations we have today, any conversations we have, general in nature.
Not financial advice, but that's a good question, Brendan.
Nothing here is advice.
Yeah, okay. So if you've got excess cash in the offset and you want to get a greater return than what it's already doing on your interest rate, so this would require a little bit of calculation because you need to work out how much of a benefit you're getting from that cash sitting there, and it could be substantial. But I guess my answer would be, it comes back to how risk averse are you and what's your time horizon and do you need that money? Because if you do not need that money and you could potentially survive, pay your mortgage off and you don't mind adding a few extra, running a few extra years on the term of the loan, then you could put it in some equities. Like that's what I'd be thinking straight away. And you could go for some relatively safe ones like an index or like a Vanguard index, S&P 500 or a global index, and then that's going to track the market returns. And as long as you've got the horizon in front of you, Brendan, then you could, earn maybe 7% after inflation on that money.
Yeah.
But
you get that question all the time as an advisor, and it's become more and more prevalent nowadays because, back even 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, interest rates were sort of hovering around that 5-6% mark. So it was a pretty good guaranteed earn when you had that money sitting in offset. But now you're sort of getting just around that inflation mark. It's got, more of a prevalence to talk about it a lot more now and say, well, is that money going to be better working elsewhere for me? So you've hit the nail on the head with a bunch of those things that you spoke about there. And, there's a lot of calculations that come into it, tax, no tax, franking credits, capital gains. The list goes on, super, different options. We sort of talk about opportunity cost is what's the opportunity you're missing out on with that money there, and is it money, going to be better worked for you elsewhere? Time horizons, risk profile, The list goes on. There's no short answer to it, but there's definitely options and things that can be considered out there for people. Absolutely. So
it's a psychological effect too. Like, how's it going to affect you, Brendan, if you take the money out, you stick it in stocks, you see a 50% drawdown because the market crashes, and then you're stuck like that, as opposed to having it sit there safe and sound in the offset. So
yeah, and I think we said before that, that emergency account we talk about in advisor land quite a lot is having that emergency money sitting there with your rainy day money. You feel very comfortable. It might be 6 months worth of your salary, stocked away there, or 12 months to say that, if the proverbial, shit hits the fan and, whatever happens, COVID, pandemics, job losses, all those things, you've got that nest egg there. Whereas if it's in stocks, it's it's a little bit less, it's more inaccessible, so it can be a little bit more challenging in that regard.
And it's volatile, right? Like
Volatile too.
Yeah, you could see it go up and down. So
Yep,
long story short, you choose, Brendan.
Seek personal advice, personal guidance, generally nature on this podcast as always. So any clients or people, listeners in their own situation, always seek personal guidance around your own situation. So thanks for that question, Brendan. That leads us on to our most enjoyable segment, which we love, which Brendan's actually thrown out to us. So 50-50. So he loves the randomness of the names, and he mentioned, I want to throw another name in there just to add to the chaos. So he's got this or that. So this or that, 50-50, what's your choice? Either or. Pick your poison. So I love that. So thanks mate. He loves the name changes. They crack him up. So, and neither of you know what to call it yet. And I forget half the names sometimes too. So, so for Brendan today, this or that. So barbecue shapes or pizza shapes?
I love this one.
Yeah, I don't think we've done it, have we? We haven't tackled it. Barbecue shape.
Let the guest go
An
first?
old Australian favourite. So for our international listeners, if you haven't tried pizza or barbecue shapes, you're not living.
The tank is international.
We've got a few international listeners, mate. Yeah, we're global.
Oh, he's got his
Worldwide.
mate from Africa?
Hola, mis amigos españoles.
Oh, right, yes, Mitchy.
The Spanish listeners?
I reckon we let Mitch go first. What do you reckon, barbecue or pizza?
Look, my nickname is Chips, so growing up, I think I lived off both of them. I'd have to say pizza at the moment, although it's hard to go past barbecue. But yeah, pizza shapes would be my staple.
Charlie?
I don't reach for either nowadays. I used to love barbecue shapes a lot as a kid. But then I did oscillate to pizza for a bit, but probably the more prevalent for me was barbecue. But I'm going to throw a third in there, chicken crimpy.
Oh, chicken crimpy? You can't throw chicken crimpy in.
Getting after chicken.
What about...
It's 50-50.
Yeah, it's 50-50, mate. You've got to choose one. And then
It's not this, that, or that.
It's this or that. How about we choose barbecue or pizza, and then we go around again and say our favourite shapes flavour?
Okay, I'll pick barbecue then. If you want to choose.
Because
Back against the wall.
I'm going pizza because I feel like barbecue is just like, it's the main shape flavour, and it's the one you always get when you're at, like, I don't know, a function or whatever. It's played out. I've had too much of it. Give me pizza.
There you go. Pizza shapes for you.
What did you say, Mitch?
Pizza, yeah, I'm pizza.
So, barbecue for me growing up. But, yeah, chicken crimpy now. The kids love chicken crimpy, so there's always a box floating around.
That's your favourite flavour now?
Love chicken crimpy, yeah.
What's your favourite shapes?
What, pizza?
What's your favourite?
Well, I reckon, yeah.
Still fave?
Yeah, still fave. Yeah.
My favourite...
Chicken crimpy, I can get out of there.
I'm going to cop so much stick from the tankers, but I'm a savoury man. I love
savoury ones.
I like the
Little
savoury.
square ones.
My missus gives me stick about this.
That's
Just plain, no flavour. She's like, this is bullshit. I'm like, no, give me the savoury shapes, man.
Give me some tax and savoury shapes.
That's like the dude that goes to Macca's and orders a fillet of fish.
I hate the fillet of fish, so don't lump me in with it.
Have you seen the movie The Accountant with Ben Affleck?
Yeah, what a baller. He'd be eating savoury shapes and taking names.
Have you got a dark side like that?
That's it. I think my second favourite's cheddar.
Cheddar?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, cheddar's all right.
Cheddar's not bad.
And I just actually had said I need to hear some more information from you about previous selections. So he says, also chocolate in the fridge is ridiculous. Chicken twisties are a poor man's chip, and sauce in the fridge I'm off. And he says I can support you with spoons in the middle, which I don't have spoons in the middle now, but I do miss it. And he says I can't give you an honest opinion on the Terminators as I haven't seen them for a hot minute. But he goes, I've definitely seen T2 a lot more than T1 if that helps. And I said, you like T2 more. That's all I needed to know.
I don't know if he said he liked it more. I think me and Brendan were aligning on a lot of those 50-50s.
Yep.
Hit Mitch with a classic, the T1 or T2.
Oh, T2 all day.
Oh my god.
Joel and I saw it, was it 2 years ago when they brought it back out to the cinemas?
You guys went and saw it in the cinema?
Yeah, well, no, it was more than 2 years ago, like 5 years ago, because it was a 20. I think it was a 20th anniversary. It's up to 25th now, maybe. But they brought it at Knox. We went out to Knox and we
that's right.
made a night of it. The brothers'
awesome.
night. Yeah,
That's
just
good,
did T2, but just back in the cinema. It was so good.
I walked into that one. I should have known you'd be on.
Have they done T1 back in the cinemas? I don't think so.
I'm going to get a petition. Good as.
So that's it for 50-50s today, or this and that.
Yeah, so if you want to get at Money in the Tank, you can get us at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube at Money in the Tank. Leave us a like, a comment, subscription, and Mitch, they're going to find you at your email. You'll drop it with us, and we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, drop it in the show notes, Arnie.
Easy, mate.
Great. And next week, stay tuned. Next week, guys, we'll be interviewing Vin from Utopian Group. So. He'll be talking all things real estate, mainly around Victoria, but just more broadly, best way to put an offer in, how offers work, Section 32, selling and buying, buying in a hot market, buying in a cold market. So, really prevalent stuff for the current environment we're in at the moment with property.
Awesome. Cheers, tankers.
All right,
Thanks,
bro,
guys. Thanks
we're
for
out.
having me.